6 women stood in that parlor, every one of them beautiful, every one of them raised for exactly this, hands soft, hair pinned, dowries counted out on paper like cattle. And Elias Coldwater looked at all 6, and he looked past them. He looked at the doorway, at the girl standing there with an ash bucket in her hands and soot on her wrist, waiting for the room to be done with her so she could clean out the grate. The girl nobody in that house had spoken a full sentence to in 9 years. I was standing at the window with rain running off my hat brim, and I heard him say it. 2 words. And the sound that came after those 2 words wasn't a gasp, it was something worse. It was silence. The kind that means a town has just decided what it's going to do to you. I've broken 611 horses in my life. I've seen animals that would rather die than bend. I'd never seen it in a person before that spring. What happened next cost that man everything he had, and I want you to understand something before we start. He knew it would. He picked her anyway. This is what I wrote down. This is what I saw. He said her. Just that, one word, flat as a fence rail, and he didn't even lift his hand to point. I was on the wrong side of the parlor window, out in the wet, holding 2 horses that didn't want holding. Rain came sideways off the draw that afternoon, the kind of March rain that has snow still riding in it, and I had my collar up and my hat down, and I was pretending to be busy, so I could keep watching through the glass like a man watching a house fire. Inside, the 6 of them turned. Mary Ellen Fenn turned first, banker's daughter out of Prescott, hair the color of new rope, and she'd been standing all afternoon with her chin at an angle she must have practiced in a mirror. Charlotte Vance turned. The Tunstall twins turned together the way they did everything. Priscilla Dyer's hand went up to her throat. And then all 6 of them followed Elias Coldwater's eyes, and the eyes went past them, past his mother in the good chair, past the tea service that hadn't been out of its crate since his father's funeral, and stopped at the parlor door, where the girl was standing with the ash bucket. She wasn't listening. That's the thing that stays with me. She was so far outside the business of that room that she hadn't even bothered to listen. She had one hip cocked to take the weight of the bucket, and her eyes were on the grate, on the cold ash in it, calculating how long it would take her to sweep it out once these people cleared off, because there was still supper to lay and 100 other things, and the day was going nowhere good. Then she noticed the quiet. I watched her look up. I watched her check behind herself, the way a person does when they're sure the trouble is aimed at somebody else. There was nobody behind her. There was just a hallway and a coat rack and 8 years of not being spoken to. Ophelia Coldwater said, "Elias." He said, "I've made my choice, Mother." And Ophelia Coldwater said, in a voice I could hear through window glass and rain, "You have not." I want to say something here before I go on, because I'm going to tell this wrong if I don't. My name is Wick Hale. I break horses. I've broken 611 of them, and I know that number because I keep a tally book in my coat, a little green ledger with a rubber band around it, and every horse gets a line, the date, the mark, the disposition. Bay Gelding, 3 white, sour but honest. Roan mare killed a man in Sonora, gentled in 9 days. My wife, before she passed, used to say I'd write down the weather at my own funeral. She wasn't wrong. It's not a system. It's a way of holding on to a life that keeps trying to slide out from under you. I'd worked the Coldwater place 11 years by then. Wolf Draw, Arizona Territory, spring of '87. 400 head of horses, the best remuda between Tucson and the Mogollon Rim, and the reason for that was Elias, who had a hand on a colt like nobody I ever saw, and the reason there was any money was his mother, who could look at a ledger the way a hawk looks at a wheat field. Elias was 34 that spring. His brother Thomas had been dead 11 years. Thomas is important, and I'll get to him. And the girl in the doorway, had been in that house 9 years, and I'd said maybe 40 words to her in all that time, and 30 of them were "Watch that gray, he bites." They called her Rain. That was not her name. Her name was Nahai, and I only know that because of what happened later, and because when I finally asked her, kneeling in the mud with a dead colt between us. But that's part two. She said it once quiet, and then she said, "Nobody here says it right. Don't bother." She was Chiricahua on her mother's side. Nobody knew about the other side, and she never volunteered. She came out of San Carlos when she was small and out of a mission school in Tucson when she was 14, and she came to the Coldwaters against a debt somebody owed somebody. And if you want the details of that arrangement, I can't give them to you because Ophelia burned the paper, and because I never asked, and because not asking is the sin I'm still carrying. She was maybe 23 that spring. She had a burn scar that ran from the inside of her left wrist up under her sleeve, from a laundry kettle when she was 16, and she was deaf in the right ear from a fever, so she'd turn her head a little when you spoke to her, tilt it like a bird, and half this valley thought that meant she was simple. She wasn't simple. She was the only person on that place who could tell you exactly how much every single thing cost, because she was the one who paid for it. Now, why there were 6 women in the parlor. Thomas Coldwater went out after strays in a January storm in '76, and they found him in April. He was the older one, the loud one, the one who was supposed to marry and fill that big ugly house with grandchildren. What came home instead was a coat and a boot, and enough for a coffin they didn't open. After that, Ophelia had one son left, and one son meant one chance, and she spent 11 years arranging that chance like a woman setting a table. Elias didn't cooperate. He went quiet the way some men go quiet, which is not peaceful. It's a man pulling everything indoors and locking it. He worked. God, he worked. He'd be at the pens before the light, and he'd talk to a green 3-year-old for an hour and never once raise his voice, and the horse would come to him, because there was nothing in him that the horse needed to be afraid of. Then he'd come up to the house and sit at supper and answer his mother in single words and go to bed. Twice she brought a girl out from Prescott. Twice he was polite and absent, and twice the girl went home. So that spring she did it all at once. She wrote to 4 families and put an advertisement in 2 papers, and on a Sunday in March she filled her parlor with 6 eligible young women, all of them told they were coming to a dinner, all of them knowing exactly what they were coming to. It was, and I say this having watched it through a window with my hat dripping, one of the most vicious things I have ever seen a mother do to her son, and I understood it. She was 61, and she was terrified of dying and leaving him alone in a house with 3 empty bedrooms. He came in from the pens with his hands scrubbed. He sat. He listened to Mary Ellen Fenn talk about Prescott, and to Charlotte Vance sing, and to the Tunstall twins be charming in stereo, and to Priscilla Dyer say something about the territory that was meant to be brave and came out as afraid. 2 hours, I counted because that's what I do. 2 hours and 11 minutes. Then Nahai came to the parlor door with her bucket, because it was 4 o'clock, and at 4 o'clock she did the grates. And Elias Coldwater stood up out of his chair like a man who has finally understood the question, and said, "Her." The room broke. Not loud. Quality doesn't break loud. It broke into small, polite pieces. A cup set down too hard. Charlotte Vance's laugh that stopped in the middle because she realized it wasn't a joke. Mary Ellen Fenn went the color of the tea. Priscilla Dyer said, "Oh," once softly, and I've thought about that "oh" for a long time. I think it was pity. I don't know who for. Ophelia Coldwater didn't move at all. That was the frightening thing. She sat in her chair with her spine straight and her hands folded, and she looked at her son for a long moment, and then she turned her head and looked at the doorway, and she looked at Nahai the way you look at a lamp that's smoking, not with hate, with irritation, as though the girl had done something clumsy. And Nahai, I have to get this exactly right, Nahai put the bucket down. She set it on the floorboards, careful, so the ash wouldn't puff. She wiped her palms on her apron. One and then the other. And she stood there in that doorway with 6 of the finest dressed women in the territory staring at her, and I saw her face do absolutely nothing. 9 years in that house. She'd had a lot of practice at nothing. Then Ophelia said, "Girl, go out to the kitchen." And Nahai went. He came out to me at the corrals after dark. Rain had quit and the sky had torn open, and it was cold enough that the puddles were skinning over. And Elias came down the slope from the house with no coat on and stood at the rail beside me and put his forearms on the wet wood. I said, "You've lost your mind." He said, "Probably." We watched the horses. There was a bay filly in the near pen I'd been working, and she came over and put her nose against his shoulder and blew, and he stood absolutely still and let her. I said, "Elias, that woman washes your shirts. I know what she does. Her mother's people are still coming down out of the Chiricahuas and killing folk, or so the Star would like everybody to believe." "Her mother's people," he said, "are dead, every one. There's 50 of them left in a stockade in Florida and the rest are dead. She hasn't got any people, Wick. That's what I'm telling you." I shut up. The filly moved off. Somewhere down the draw, a coyote started up and got no answer. I said more careful, "Is it charity?" Because I had to ask. Because there's a kind of man who marries a broken thing so he can look at himself in the shaving mirror, and I'd have rather he was a coward than that. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, 4 years ago I was hauling the black stallion out of a bog on Cutter Creek, and I went into my chest, and the rope fouled, and I was going to die there. Nobody within 3 miles. And she came over that rise with a wash basket on her hip because that's where she does the wash, and she saw, and she put the basket down and she went into that mud in her skirts and she got under the rope." He turned his hands over, looking at them. "She was in there with me an hour. I've seen grown men quit at 10 minutes. When we came out she couldn't hardly stand and she tore her hands open on that rope and she was shaking so bad she couldn't get the basket up. And she said," he stopped. He laughed, one breath, no humor in it. "She said, 'Don't tell your mother about the wash,' because it had got in the mud. That's what she was frightened of." The cold was in my knee. I shifted my weight. "I've watched her every day since," he said. "For years. Wick, I have watched that woman get up before this whole house and go to bed after it, and take everything my mother has to hand out, and never once, not once, take it out on somebody smaller than her. Cora's boy Isaac had the croup 2 winters back and she sat up with him 3 nights and then did her work. There's not a soul on this place who's earned anything the way she has." He straightened up off the rail. "They put 6 women in there and told me to pick the best one," he said. "So I did. I want to be honest, because I said I would be." Standing there in the cold, I did not think, "What a fine man." I thought, "You selfish son of a bitch." Because he'd never asked her. He'd stood up in a room full of people and said her, and he had not asked her, and the difference between those 2 things is the difference between a gift and a rope. I said so, roughly. I don't remember the words, but I remember his face when I got to the end of them, and it was the face of a man who's just been shown the one thing he managed not to look at. He went up to the house. I found out later from Cora what happened next, that he knocked at the kitchen door like a caller, and that Nahai opened it with a knife in her hand because she was cutting salt pork, and that he stood on the step in the cold and said what he had to say, and that she listened with her head tilted, the good ear toward him, and that when he was finished she said, "Why?" Not "Why me?" just "Why?" flat, like she was checking a sum. He told her about Cutter Creek. And she said, "Cora swears to this, that was 4 years ago." And Elias said, "Yes." And Nahai said, "Then you had 4 years to say thank you and you didn't, and now you want a wife." She set the knife down. "Go to bed, Mr. Coldwater." And she shut the door on him. Cora said he stood on that step in the dark for a while. Then he went around and came in the front. She didn't say no. Understand, she didn't say yes either, not that night, not for 11 days. What she did was keep doing the grates and the wash and the salt pork, and every morning Elias Coldwater got up and went to the pens and came back and asked her again, and every time he asked, he'd first say one true thing he'd never said to her. Small things. I never thanked you. I let my mother call you Rain for 9 years, and I never once used your name because I was afraid I'd say it wrong. I don't know how old you are. I know this because Cora Pike heard every word from the pantry, and Cora Pike could not hold water. On the fourth day, Ophelia stopped speaking to her son, not in the theatrical way. She simply removed him, passed him the bread, answered his questions with a lift of one eyebrow at Cora, who would then repeat the question and get the answer and pass it back, and the two of them sat at that table for 11 days conducting a conversation through a cook. On the sixth day, Ophelia offered Nahai money. That's not a rumor. Nahai told me herself later, and she told it laughing, which was worse than if she'd cried. $60 and a ticket to anywhere the railroad went. And Nahai said she stood there and did arithmetic. 9 years of unpaid work at $1 a week would be $468. She'd known that number for a long time. She'd been keeping it in her head the way I keep horses in a book. She said no. And Ophelia said, "Then you're a fool and you'll be a fool in this house, and I'll not have you in my parlor." Nahai said, "I clean your parlor." I'd have paid money to see the old woman's face. Now here's where it stopped being a family matter. Ferris Doone ran 2,000 head of cattle on the east side of the draw, and he'd wanted the Coldwater water rights since before I came. He was 50, wide, red-faced, and had a way of being friendly that made your neck itch. He rode over on the 12th day with 3 of his hands and a piece of paper. The paper said Nahai was indentured. It said the debt that put her in that house had been assigned, bought, that is, from whoever originally held it, and that Ferris Doone now held it, and it had 4 years left to run, and he was here to collect his property. He said the word property standing in the yard with his hat off, polite as Sunday. Elias read the paper twice. I was at the corral gate with a hoof knife in my hand and no gun, because I'd stopped wearing 1 year's back, and I remember thinking very clearly that I was about to watch a man get killed, and I did not know which one. But Elias just folded the paper up and handed it back. He said, "How much?" Doone smiled. He said a number. It was $1,100, which was roughly what 40 saddle horses were worth that year, and everybody standing in that yard knew that the Coldwater place had $1,100 the way a church has whiskey. And Ophelia Coldwater came out onto the porch and said, "Mr. Doone, will you take coffee?" She'd have paid it. That's the thing that turns my stomach even now. Not to save the girl, to be rid of her, to have her legally gone, hauled off in a wagon, and to have her son standing in the yard unable to stop it. She'd have paid $1,100 for that. But Nahai came out the kitchen door with her sleeves still rolled. She walked up to Ferris Doone and she looked at that paper in his hand, and she said, and her voice was so ordinary, that's what I remember, she might have been asking him if he wanted the cream. "There's a name on that, whose?" Doone's smile went a little sideways. "Beg pardon." "The debt, it was somebody's, whose name is on it." And Doone said, because he could not help himself, because men like that never can, "Why, it's your father's girl." The yard went very still. I watched her take that. I watched it hit her, and I watched her not fall down. Something happened behind her eyes, a door opening onto a room she'd known was there all her life and never been allowed into, and she stood in that yard with her rolled sleeves and her burned scar showing, and she said, "Show me." And he wouldn't. He laughed and folded it and put it inside his coat and said something about business and ladies, and mounted up, and told Elias he'd be back in 14 days with the sheriff, and rode out. 14 days, $1,100. Nahai stood in the yard after the dust settled. Elias went to her. He didn't touch her. She said, "I never knew he had a name." And then she went back inside and finished the salt pork. Because it was Tuesday. That night I sat up with my tally book, and I did something I'd never done in 11 years of that green ledger. I wrote down a person. March 30th, N wouldn't take $60, wouldn't take the train. I sat looking at it a long while, then I added, don't know her name. We had 12 days to find $1,100, and we had 400 horses and no buyer, because the Army contract went to Dune's cousin in Tucson, which is a coincidence I'll leave you to think about. Elias didn't sleep. He rode to Prescott and came back with nothing. He rode to a man in Camp Verde and came back with less. Ophelia sat in her chair by the window with the ledger open on her knees and never turned a page, and once, passing the door, I saw her with her hand over her mouth and I went on by like I hadn't. And Nahai worked. That's what she did. That's what she'd always done, and I think for the first week we all made the same mistake of believing that was all she was doing. But she'd started going out at night. I saw her the first time on the 4th of April, near midnight, crossing the yard with a lantern shuttered down to a coin of light, going east toward the draw. I told myself it was none of my business. Second time, the 6th, same hour, same direction, and she was carrying something in a flour sack that swung heavy. Third time I followed her. I'm not proud of it. I had my knee and I had no wind and I lost her inside a mile. And I stood in the dark and listened to that country the way you do when you're 43 and alone in it. The wind coming up the draw, and a nighthawk, and far off, faint, what might have been a horse and might have been nothing. I went home. I wrote in the book, "In Gone Again doesn't run, walks." Because that's what stopped me. If she'd been running, I'd have understood. 14 days to a wagon and a bill of sale, and any sensible creature runs. She wasn't running. She was going out and coming back and getting up at 4:30 and doing the greats. On the 9th day, somebody hamstrung the black stallion. I found him at first light in the near pen, standing on 3 legs and shaking, and he was the best horse in the territory and worth $600, and I had to look at him for a while before I could make myself go get Elias. The cut was clean. A person had done it with a knife in the dark, to an animal that trusted people, and I want to say plainly that in a long life I have not hated anything the way I hated whoever's hand that was. Elias came down and looked at the horse. He stood there in the wet grass in his shirt sleeves, and he didn't say a word. Then he went back up to the house and got the rifle, and I put myself in front of him, and we had a conversation in the yard that I won't repeat. And at the end of it, he sat down on the chopping block with the rifle across his knees and put his hands over his face. 34 years old, never cried at his brother's funeral, cried over a horse. His mother watched from the porch. And it was Nahai who took the rifle out of his hands. She just walked up and lifted it away from him, easy, like taking a plate, and she carried it into the house. Then she came back out and she went into the pen. The stallion wouldn't let any of us near him. He put us all on the rails, screaming, striking with his good legs. She went in with nothing, no rope, no grain, and she stood in the middle of that pen, and she turned her back on him. She stood there. I don't know how long. Long enough that the sun came up over the ridge and got in my eyes. Long enough that my knee gave out and I sat down on the ground with my back to the post. And that horse circled her and screamed and came in and went out. And she never once looked at him, and she never moved, and she was talking the whole time, low, steady, not English, and it was the most words I ever heard out of her. He came in, he put his muzzle against the back of her neck, and he stayed. Elias beside me said, "God." And I said, and I'll answer for this, she's the one that's been going out at night. He didn't ask her. That's the part that undoes me still. He had 9 days left, and a crippled stallion, and a mother who wasn't speaking to him, and a man riding over with a sheriff, and a piece of paper with her father's name on it. And I had just handed him a reason to doubt her. And Elias Coldwater looked at me for a long moment with his eyes still red, and he said, "Wick, I'd take it kindly if you never say that to me again." Then he went and got the pistol, and he put the stallion down himself, in the pen, with her holding the halter and her forehead against the horse's forehead. And he did it quick and clean, and then he sat down in the mud beside it. She sat down too. The two of them sat in the mud with that dead horse between them for an hour while the flies came, and Ophelia watched from the porch, and I stood at the rail with my hat in my hands like a fool. That's when I finally asked her name. She said it. I've spelled it as best I can, and I know I've spelled it wrong. Then she said, "Don't bother, nobody here says it right." And Elias, without lifting his head, said it. Said it right. She looked at him for a long, long time. That night I couldn't sleep, and I was out at the pens near 2 in the morning when I saw the shuttered lantern come across the yard again. Only this time she wasn't alone. Elias was with her, both of them on foot, both of them leading horses with the tack muffled in sacking, and behind them, I counted, because I count 9 more head on a string, good ones, the 4-year-olds, the ones we'd been grooming for the army contract we didn't get. $1,100 of horse, near enough, walking east up the draw at 2 in the morning. I stepped out from the shadow of the barn. Elias stopped. He looked at me with the lantern light coming up under his hat brim, and neither of us said anything, and I understood that whatever I did in the next 4 seconds was going to be the thing I'd have to live with. And Nahi said quietly, "Wick, come or go, but decide now." I said, "Come, I guess." That's all. 43 years old, a bad knee, 611 horses in a green ledger, and the biggest decision of my life came out of me sounding like a man agreeing to a second helping of beans. Nahi nodded once and turned east. We took the 9 4-year-olds up the draw with their hooves in sacking, and nobody spoke for 2 miles, and the only sounds were the muffled step of horses and the wind coming down off the rim with the smell of wet juniper in it, and my own breath, which was too loud. Finally I said, "Where?" Elias said, "Old Kettle Tank. There's a box canyon behind it, holds water, holds grass. Dune comes with the sheriff, he can't attach what he can't find. And the rest of the remuda." "Dune can have the rest," Elias said. "He can have every horse on that place, he'll not have her." I said nothing to that, but I thought, and I'm ashamed of the thought, and I'm putting it down because I said I would, she's not yours to give away either, son. It took us till 4 in the morning to get them in. Kettle Tank is a stone bowl the size of a church, and behind it there's a slot you'd ride past 100 times, and behind that there's 40 acres of grass with walls on 3 sides. Elias' brother Thomas found it when he was a boy. It was the only time all night I heard Elias say his brother's name, and he said it the way you touch a scar to see if it still goes deep. We got the horses in. We stopped up the slot with brush. And then Nahi picked up her flour sack, the heavy one, the one I'd watched swing across the yard 3 nights running, and she started walking north, away from the tank, up into the broken country. I looked at Elias. He said, "Go with her, she'll not let me carry it." Here's what was in the sack. 4 pounds of cornmeal, a twist of coffee, a tin of lard, 2 of Elias' old shirts washed and folded, a bottle of paregoric with maybe an inch left in it, and a knuckle of ginger root which I did not understand and did not ask about. We climbed for an hour. My knee did what my knee does. She stopped twice, both times without looking back, both times just stopped and waited and started again when I caught up, and never once said anything about it, and I have been shown mercy by a lot of people in my life, and none of it was as kind as that. Near the top there's an overhang the Mexicans call la boca, the mouth. There was a fire in it, banked to nothing, and beside the fire, wrapped in a wool blanket I recognized because I'd slept under its twin in the bunkhouse for 11 years, there was an old man. He was Chiricahua. He was, I'd guess, 70. He had a wound in his hip that had gone bad a long time ago and gone quiet a long time ago, and was now doing whatever the third thing is that such wounds do. And the smell in that overhang told me the answer before I got close enough to look. He opened one eye at me. He said something to her. She answered. He laughed, a dry sound, no strength in it, and she knelt down and started building up the fire with her back very straight, and I stood at the mouth of that place with my hat in my hands and did arithmetic of my own. Harboring, that was the word for what she was doing. Geronimo had come in the September before. The ones who'd surrendered were on trains to Florida, and the ones who hadn't were being hunted, and there was money on them, and a man who fed one could hang, and a woman who fed one. I sat down on a rock because my legs had opinions. She said without turning, "You can go back. He won't know you were here." I said, "How long?" "Since the harvest moon." 7 months. 7 months of walking 11 miles up and 11 miles back in the dark, and getting up at 4:30 and doing the grates. I said, "Elias knows." "Since Christmas." She fed a stick into the fire. "He carried the flour up twice. Then I told him not to come. If they hang somebody for this, it should be one of us, not two." The old man said something. She said something back sharp. He said it again, and this time he lifted one hand off the blanket and pointed it at me, and there was something in his face, amusement, I think, real amusement, the first I'd seen on a human face in a fortnight, and she went still. I said, "What?" She didn't answer for a while. Then she said, "He wants to know if you're the one who cries over the horses." I've been called a good many things. I sat on that rock in an outlaw's camp with my hat in my hands, and I said, "Tell him yes." She told him. And the old man closed his eye and said one word, and she translated it, and her voice did something on the way out. She said, "He says good." His name was Chi. Not his name, the name white men had given him at San Carlos, and he'd kept it out of what I now believe was spite, and he was the last living person on this earth who had known Nahai's mother. He'd come out of the Sierra matter with 4 others. 3 died on the way north. The 4th walked off one night in December and never came back, and Chi wouldn't say where, which meant he knew. And he was the reason she wouldn't take Ophelia Coldwater's $60 and her ticket to anywhere the railroad went. I understood it, finally, sitting on that rock. Everybody in Wolf Draw had spent 11 days privately deciding that the girl in the doorway was either a schemer or a saint, and the whole time she'd been the only one of us with something that couldn't be bought, and it was 9 pounds of dying old man in a hole in the rocks. She'd have gone to Florida with him if she could. She'd have gone to the stockade. She could not go to Prescott. I got out my ledger. I sat there in the firelight and I wrote, in a hand that came out crooked. April 9th. Nahai spelled it wrong, I know. She has been carrying 11 miles uphill for 7 months, and nobody on that ranch noticed she was tired. We came down at dawn. Elias was asleep across the slot with a rifle over his knees and his mouth open, and he woke when the shale slid under me and had the gun up before his eyes were open, and then he saw us and put it down and rubbed his face. He said, "How is he?" She said, "Dying." And Elias, I watched this. Elias didn't say "I'm sorry," and he didn't say he's better off, and he didn't say any of the 11 useless things I was already assembling in my own mouth. He said, "Then he shouldn't be alone." She looked at him. She stood there in the gray light with her hair come down and her hands still smelling of that overhang, and she looked at Elias Coldwater for a long moment, and something in her face moved. That was the first time I thought she might say yes. The setback came on the 11th day, and it came the way they do, in an envelope. Ferris Doone did not need to wait for a sheriff. He sent word to the bank at Prescott that the Coldwater note, a matter of $400, borrowed against the spring calving 3 years back and paid down faithful, was, in his opinion as a concerned neighbor, at risk. And the bank called it. $400, 11 days. On top of $1,100 for the paper. We took the 9 4-year-olds down to Cerro, Colorado, to a mining outfit that bought horses by the pound and asked nothing. 2 days riding. We got there, and the buyer was a Welshman with a hat too small for him, and he walked around those horses for an hour and put his hand on the shoulder of the best colt I ever raised and said, 600 for the lot. Elia said they were worth 11. The Welshman said mildly that a man from Wolf Draw had ridden through on Tuesday and mentioned that some Coldwater stock might be coming down, and that title might be unsettled, and that he'd hate to buy trouble. 600. Elia stood in that yard with his hands hanging. And I watched a thing happen to him that I have watched happen to horses, the moment where they stop fighting the rope not because they've gentled, but because something inside has finally torn. And I stepped up and said, quick, 700, and you take the sorrel too. The sorrel was mine. I'd raised her from a 2-day-old orphan, number 490 in the Green Book. Kind, won't quit, nose like a dog's. The Welshman said 700. Elia said, wick. I said, shut up, Elias. We rode home double on his horse, 40 miles. He didn't say thank you, and I'd have hit him if he had. $700, 800 short. We got in at midnight, and there was a lamp burning in the parlor. Ophelia Coldwater was sitting in her chair with the ledger open on her knees, and this time she'd turned the pages, and she'd been turning them for 2 days, and there was a decanter on the table beside her with the stopper out, which in 11 years I had never once seen. She said, sit down, Elias. He said, Mother, I'm too tired. Sit down. He sat. And she took a paper out of the ledger and put it on the table and pushed it across with 2 fingers, the way you push something you don't want the smell of on your hand. It was an assignment of indenture. It was dated the 4th of November, 1881. It transferred the remaining term of 1 reign, Ward Minor Dow, of Jacob Rain, decked from the estate of Josiah Coldwater to Mr. Ferris Doone, for the sum of $40. And it was signed in a small tight hand, Ophelia M. Coldwater, executrix. Nobody said anything. Cora Pike was in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel, and she put it against her mouth. Ophelia said, I signed 9 papers that November. Your father left the estate in a state. There were 9, and it took a morning, and I was. She stopped. She put her hand flat on the ledger. I don't remember signing it. That's the truth, and it's the worst thing about it. I sold 4 years of a child's life for $40, and I don't remember doing it. Elia said very low, she was 14. Yes. She was in this house. She was upstairs in this house when you signed it. Yes. And you kept her. You kept her 9 years and let her clean your grates and let this whole valley call her rain like she was weather. Because I did not look, Ophelia said, and her voice broke on the word look, and she pressed her mouth shut and got it back. Because there was always a great deal to be done, and she did it, and I did not look at her. I did not look at either of my sons. I have been managing this family for 20 years, and I do not believe I have looked directly at a living soul since 1876. Thomas, she meant Thomas. She reached down beside the chair and brought up a leather case and opened it, and inside was her mother's jewelry, which was not much, and a deed to 80 acres in Ohio, and $140 in gold. She said, it's 400 if the deed sells. It won't sell by Thursday. Elias put his face in his hands. And that's when the kitchen door opened. Nahai had been standing outside it, in the cold on the step with her shawl on, listening, because she was deaf in the right ear, and the parlor is on the left side of that hallway, and she'd heard every word and she'd had to stand and hear it. She came in. She walked to the table and she picked the paper up. And she read it. I have never in my life seen a room understand something so fast and so completely. Ophelia Coldwater's face. I want to be fair to that woman. She'd just torn her own guts out on a parlor table. But her face when that girl's eyes went left to right across those lines and stopped, and went back and stopped again. 9 years. Nobody in that house had ever once thought to wonder. Mission school in Tucson, 6 years of it, she read Latin. She said Jacob Rain. Her finger was on the name. She said this is a man. This is a person. He had a name. She looked up and she was not crying, and it would have been easier on all of us if she had been. You have called me Rain for 9 years. You took it off this paper. You took my father's name off a bill of sale and put it on me like a collar, and you never once. She stopped. She put the paper down very carefully, the way she'd set down the ash bucket. Then she went out the kitchen door, and Elias went after her, and I stood in that parlor with the old woman and the decanter, and neither of us could look at the other one. After a while Ophelia said to nobody, "It was on the top of the paper. It was the only thing written on it. It seemed easier." I put my hat on and went out to the barn. She went up the mountain that night and stayed 2 days. She knew the name. She told me this later, much later in the winter, when there was a fire and it had got easy enough between us for such things. Jacob Rain had been an army packer at Fort Bowie. He'd taken up with her mother in the way of such men, and unlike most of them he'd come back, kept coming back, 6 years. And then in the spring of '77 the Chiricahua were moved to San Carlos, and in '81 half of them broke out, and by '86 there was nothing left to move anywhere. And the ones who'd surrendered were put on a train to Florida with their children, and most of those children died of the damp in the first 2 years. Nahi was 8, she was on the list. Jacob Rain went to a judge at Tucson and swore that the child was his, which was true, and that he owed a debt of $200, which was not, and he indentured her against it to a rancher named Josiah Coldwater, because an indentured servant is not a hostel and does not go on the train. Then he went back to Fort Bowie and was dead within the year, and she did not say of what, and Nahi did not ask. She had spent 9 years scrubbing the floors of the house that saved her life. Both things are true. That's what I can't get past even now all these years on. That both things are true, and there is no arranging them so that they stop being true, and the man who did it loved her, and it was still a bill of sale, and she still had to carry the bucket. She told me that she said one thing to her about it, up in the overhang on the last night. He said he kept you out of Florida. I was in Florida. And then he asked her to say her mother's name, out loud in the open, because he was the last one who could hear it said right, and he wanted to hear it once more. She said it. He died on the 14th of April, near dawn. She buried him herself. She wouldn't let Elias help, and she wouldn't let me, and she was up there most of a day and came down at dusk with her hands wrecked, and she walked past all of us and went into the kitchen and started supper. Cora Pike took the knife out of her hand and sat her down. That is the only time I ever saw Nahi cry, and it was for 11 seconds, and then she got up and finished the salt pork, because it was Thursday. Ferris Doone came on the 16th. He came with the sheriff, who was a decent enough man named Holly's Peck, who'd rather have been anywhere on God's earth, and he came with 5 hands, and he came with the paper. We were $700 and $140 in gold, and a deed nobody wanted, $840. Elias walked out into the yard and put it on the porch rail, every dollar of it. He said, $840. I'll owe you the rest, and you can hold the note against the creek pasture. Take it. And Ferris Doone looked at that money for a long moment. He looked at it the way a man looks at a hand of cards he doesn't need. And he said, no. And I understood all at once, standing there with a hoof knife in my hand for the second time in a month, exactly what this had been from the beginning, and I felt like the world's oldest fool. He'd never wanted her. He'd never wanted her for a day. He wanted Elias Coldwater to strip that ranch to the bone in 14 days, sell his horses under the market, mortgage his water, and come out into this yard with everything he had in the world stacked on a porch rail, and then he wanted to say no. Because the note at the bank came due Thursday, and a man with no horses and no cash cannot pay a note, and when the bank takes wolf draw, the creek goes with it, and Ferris Doone has 2,000 head of thirsty cattle and a cousin in Tucson. The girl was a lever. That's all. 9 years of that woman's life, and it was a lever, and he was going to use it and set it down and never think of her again. Dune folded the paper into his coat and said, pleasant as a deacon, "Fetch her out then." She came out on her own. She'd been standing inside the screen door. She was always standing just inside a door in this whole business. That's the thing. Always at the edge of the room where the deciding was happening. And she came out with her shawl over her arm and her hair pinned, and she walked down the porch steps. Elias moved, and she put her hand flat against his chest without looking at him. Later he told me what she'd said to him the night before, in the kitchen, when he'd sworn on his father's grave that he would put a bullet in Ferris Dune before he let her go. She'd said, "You stood up in your mother's parlor and chose me without asking. Don't do it twice." So he stood there with her palm on his chest and let her go by. She walked out to Ferris Dune's stirrup and she looked up at him. She said 4 years. Dune said, "That's what the paper says." "Then I'll do 4 years. Her voice carried. That's what I remember. It wasn't loud, but it went all the way across that yard and up onto the porch where Ophelia Coldwater was standing with both hands on the rail. "I'll cook and I'll wash and I'll clean your grates, and in 4 years I'll walk out of your house and I'll never think of you again as long as I live. Take me and leave him his water." And there was a silence in that yard I can still hear. Because she had done the arithmetic. She'd done it in the kitchen at 4 in the morning, the way she did every number in that valley. 4 years of her life against a man's whole world, and she'd looked at both columns and found them uneven, and she had decided, alone, unasked, that hers was the smaller. I want to be careful here. That was not nobility. Do not let anybody tell you that was nobility. That was a woman who had been taught since she was 8 years old exactly what she was worth, and who had learned the lesson so well she could do the sum in her head. That is the most terrible thing I have ever watched a person do. And Ferris Dune looked down at her from that horse. He looked at the burn scar and the shawl and the mended hem, and he laughed one short, ugly, incredulous bark of a laugh, and he said, "Girl, what in God's name would I want with you?" He turned his horse. He said something to Sheriff Peck about Thursday and the bank, and the whole party rode out of the yard, and Ferris Dune never once looked back, because he had already forgotten her, because she had never been in it at all. Nahai stood in the middle of the yard. The dust settled on her boots. Here's what nobody expects, and it's why I'm still writing this down 30 years on, in a room in Prescott with a bad knee and a ledger full of horses and one woman. She started walking. Not to the house. Out. Down the wagon road east in the direction Dune had gone, with her shawl over her arm and nothing else, and Elias called her name, said it right, and she did not stop and she did not turn. It's 22 miles from the Coldwater place to the Dune place. She walked it. I don't know what was in her. I have thought about it for 30 years and I do not know. I think a person can be told what she's worth for so long and so patiently that when a man finally refuses to buy her, something in her cannot bear it, has to go and stand in front of him and make him look. And I think it is the single bravest and most broken thing I have ever heard of a human being doing, and the two are not separate. Elias saddled up. Ophelia came off that porch faster than I ever saw her move and caught his bridle. She said no. He said, "Mother, get your hands off." And Ophelia Coldwater, 61 years old, executrix, $40, 9 papers in a morning, said, "Let her arrive, Elias, for once in her life. Let her go somewhere because she chose it." She held that bridle till her son got down. I have never forgiven that woman. I do not think Nahai ever entirely did either. But I have never in my life heard anything truer said in a ranch yard, and it was said by the person who had earned the right to say it by being the reason it needed saying. She came back at dawn on the 18th. 22 miles out and 22 back, and I was at the corrals because I hadn't slept. And I saw her come up the wagon road in that gray light with her shawl round her shoulders and her hair down, and her walk gone bad from the boots. I got the gate. She stopped in front of me. Her mouth was cracked. There was blood dried on her wrist where she'd caught it on something in the dark. She said, "Wick, I want to ask you something and I want a true answer." I said, "All right." She said, "You keep a book. Everything that's yours goes in the book." "That's so. Am I in it?" And I stood there in the cold with my hand on the gate, and I could not speak. I got the green ledger out of my coat with the rubber band around it, and I put it in her hands, and I walked away, down along the rail, and stood with my back to her, and looked at nothing for about 10 minutes while the light came up. When I came back, she was sitting on the mounting block with the book open on her knees at the page where I'd written "Don't know her name," and her thumb was on it. She said, "It's spelled wrong." I said, "I know." She took the pencil out of the spine, and she crossed it out, and she wrote it underneath correct in that small, clean mission school hand. Then she gave me back my book. What she said to Ferris Doone in his own yard at midnight, she never told anybody. Not me, not Elias, not in 30 years. I know he sold his interest in the Tucson bank in June. I know the note on Wolf Draw was extended for reasons Holly's Peck could not account for and did not care to. I know that Doone was gone out of the territory inside 2 years, and that when his name came up, ever, at any table where Nahi was sitting, she would go on eating and say nothing, and the subject would die of exposure. She never spoke of it. She had that much of her own at the end, and by God she was owed it. She didn't marry him that year. She went into Ophelia Coldwater's parlor on the 20th of April, in her working clothes, with her hands wrecked from a grave up on the mountain, and she stood in the middle of the room instead of in the doorway, and she laid out her terms like a woman selling horses. Wages, $1 a week and 9 years of back wages, $468, which she had been carrying in her head since she was 14, and which she would take in land on the North Bench in her own name, filed at Prescott. A room with a lock on the door. And that no person on that place, ever again, for any reason, would call her Rain. Ophelia sat with her hands folded in her lap and heard every word. Then she said, "The land's poor on the North Bench." Nahi said, "I know what the land is. I've been walking it at night for 7 months. And Ophelia Coldwater, I was in the hall, Cora Pike was in the pantry. This house never in its life had a private conversation." Ophelia Coldwater said, "Take the creek section instead." They were married in the fall of '88. There were 9 people there. Cora made the cake and I gave the bride away because there was nobody else on this earth to do it, and I have never been so frightened in my life as I was walking that woman across that grass. That's most of it. There's a thing I've left out, and I've left it out because I've never known where it belongs. The night she came back from Dunes, before she slept, she went up the mountain one more time. I know because I followed her again, and this time I didn't lose her, and I stood off in the rocks and watched her sit down beside a mound of stones in the dark for a long while. She'd brought the paper. Elias had got it out of Dune's coat somehow, or Peck had, or it doesn't matter. She had the indenture in her hands, the one with her father's name on it and Ophelia's signature and the $40, and I fully expected to watch it burn. She didn't burn it. She read it out loud. All of it, every line of the lawyer's language in a flat, clear voice, up there in the dark to a dead man who couldn't hear it and another dead man who couldn't either. Then she folded it and put it inside her dress. She kept that paper her whole life. It's in a box in the top of my closet now, along with the green ledger, and a photograph taken at Prescott in 1903 of a woman with gray coming in at the temples, standing beside 1,100 acres of creek pasture in her own name. I've thought and thought about why she kept it. I've got theories. I've had 30 years of theories, and every one of them is the kind of neat, satisfying, over-explained thing that a man tells himself so he can stop lying awake. The truth is I asked her once, in the winter, by the fire when it had got easy between us. She said, she looked at the fire for a while and she said, "Wick, you write down every horse you ever broke." And I said yes. And she said, "Why?"